In October of 1994, the Clearwater River ran lower than anyone could remember. Fishermen said you could see the bones of the river, old branches, rusted signs, the occasional deer skull. But that year, under the steel bridge that connects Millbrook and Riverside, something else surfaced. Something black and white buried in the silt like a secret. And once they pulled it out, the whole town had to remember what it had tried to forget. Before I go any further, let me know where you're listening from down in the comments, and hit that like and subscribe if stories like this ever brushed close to your own hometown. Every click helps bring another lost name back into the light. My name is Michael Landry. I'm 42 now, and I live just outside Albany. But I grew up in Millbrook, New York, a quiet place back then, the kind of town where every grocery store clerk knew your name and no one locked their doors unless it was winter. My sister Sarah and I were 2 years apart. She was younger, sharper, always more comfortable behind the wheel than I was. We grew up in a brown 2-story house on Grove Street, half a block from the library. Our dad was a high school teacher. Our mom made cakes out of our kitchen that half the county would order from. By the time I passed the bar, Sarah had already joined the police force. She worked Patrol Highway 9 mostly, and I ended up in the district attorney's office down in Albany. It was something we shared, I guess, a belief in rules, in doing things the right way. In the fall of 1979, Sarah was planning a spring wedding with her fiancé, David. He was an engineer, soft-spoken, but solid. She was happy, settled. She had no reason to leave, no history of trouble, no signs of anything wrong. But that's the part I can't shake all these years later. Because looking back, there were things I missed. Little things. Sarah started coming home later, not from work, but from sitting alone in the station parking lot. I saw her once just sitting in the patrol car after her shift ended, staring out across the lot like she was waiting for someone to show up. Another time, I remember her coming over for Sunday dinner. She barely touched her food, kept fiddling with her watch like she had somewhere to be. When I asked what was on her mind, she smiled and said, "Just tired, Mikey. You know how night shifts mess with you." I believed her. We all did. That October, I got a postcard from her. Nothing dramatic, just a snapshot of a little diner up near Lake Champlain. She'd written, "We should go here sometime. Feels like the kind of place where people don't lie to each other." I stuck it on my fridge. I didn't think twice. And then came the call. Not from Sarah. From her lieutenant. Just after midnight. He said she'd missed her 10:30 radio check. Said dispatch had tried to raise her, no answer. Said they were looking, but it was probably nothing. Only it wasn't. And from that night forward, nothing about Millbrook or my sister's story was ever simple again. When I walked into the station that morning, everything felt too quiet. The kind of quiet that settles into a place before bad news has a name. I'd made the drive from Albany before sunrise, unable to sleep after that phone call. The dispatcher had said they were conducting a search, but I knew by his voice they weren't expecting to find Sarah sipping coffee at a diner. The town's police chief, Captain Hayes, at the time, met me just inside the lobby. He had the kind of face people trusted, on instinct, square jaw, pressed uniform, the whole bit. But something about his eyes struck me that morning. Not sadness, not fear, just distance. He said they were coordinating with the county sheriff's office, that search teams were out along Highway 9, and that they'd keep me informed of anything significant. I asked if I could ride with one of the search units. He hesitated, said it wasn't standard protocol for civilians. I reminded him I wasn't just a civilian. I was Sarah's brother. And a former prosecutor. After a moment, he nodded. The cruiser they put me in headed straight for mile marker 23. That was the last confirmed location from Sarah's radio check-in the night before. The officer driving didn't talk much. I sat there in the passenger seat, scanning the roadside like she might still be there, pulled over somewhere with a flat tire or a dead battery. But deep down, I knew better. At the scene, there was nothing. No broken guardrail, no tire tracks, no skid marks. Just the wind blowing through dry leaves and the endless hum of cars passing by like it was any other Thursday. Over the next 48 hours, they brought in dogs, helicopters, divers. They canvassed gas stations and rest stops, questioned known troublemakers, combed both riverbanks. But there was no sign of Sarah. Not her car, not her badge, not even a scrap of uniform. The shift captain's theory was that she might have had some kind of personal crisis. Maybe pressure from the job. Maybe cold feet about the wedding. Hayes echoed that idea during our meeting that afternoon. He said, "Sometimes officers carry more than they let on." I asked him if they'd found any evidence to support that theory. A note? A phone record? A transaction? He said no. Then he added, "But absence is a kind of evidence, too." I didn't say anything to that. Just looked at the framed commendations on his wall and wondered how many people had taken his word without asking for more. I stayed in Millbrook for weeks. I sat in on briefings, sifted through reports, walked stretches of Highway 9 myself. At night, I stayed at Mom and Dad's, lying awake listening for the phone to ring. Sometimes I drove out to the bridge near the river and just watched the water. In late October, they officially reclassified her case as a voluntary disappearance. That word stuck with me. Voluntary. As if Sarah had just walked off into the night without so much as a goodbye. As if none of us knew her. I started my own investigation not long after. Quietly at first. I requested her personnel file, read through her case logs, tried to piece together what she'd been working on. Nothing stood out. Just routine stops, expired registrations, tail lights, minor speeding. But I noticed one strange detail the night she disappeared. She wasn't supposed to be on evening patrol. She'd been scheduled for the day shift. The roster had been updated just 2 hours before her new shift started. That change came from Captain Hayes. I filed that away and kept going. I called her fiancé, David. He'd moved to California after everything tried to build a new life. When I told him what little we'd found, his voice broke. He said he never believed she ran. Said she called him the night before she disappeared. Left a message saying she had something to talk to him about. Something serious, but she'd wait until the weekend when he flew in. He still had the voicemail. I asked him to send me a copy. It was short, just her voice saying, "There's something I need to tell you. It's not about us, but it's big, and I need to do the right thing." I took that to the department. Hayes said he'd log it, but reminded me again that speculation didn't make a case. A few officers tried to be kind. One offered to share patrol footage from that week. Another admitted Sarah had seemed on edge lately. But no one had anything solid. And after a while, the effort faded. The press stopped calling. Her name fell out of conversation, and Millbrook moved on. Except I didn't. 15 years passed. I left the DA's office, started my own firm, handled missing persons and wrongful death cases. People assumed it was just a career pivot, but it was always about Sarah. Every case was practice. Every deposition was preparation. I told myself if I ever got the chance to find the truth about her, I'd be ready. And then in the fall of 1994, during a dry season when the river ran lower than usual, a fisherman named Jake Morrison spotted something under the water near the old bridge. It was black and white, faded, covered in algae, but unmistakably a patrol car from the late 70s. The divers pulled it out 2 days later, and once they matched the VIN, it was confirmed it was Sarah's unit, the one she drove the night she vanished. I got the call in my office. Detective Torres was on the other end. She didn't sugarcoat it, just said, "Mr. Landry, we found a vehicle in the river." And I think it changes everything. The car was pulled onto a flatbed under a gray sky, the kind that rolls in heavy over the valley before a rainstorm. I was there when they opened it. The inside was ruined, flood-worn, rusted through, but there were things that stood out. The driver's door was crushed inward like it had been struck with real force, and there were stains on the passenger seat that looked too dark to be rust. Torres said they'd send everything to forensics, that it would take time. But even then, even before we had a report or a statement or a test result, I could feel it. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a breakdown. And this wasn't something Sarah walked away from. Back at the station, Torres let me sit with the original case file. I remembered every page, every line I'd read 15 years earlier. But now I saw what was missing. No record of the vehicle Sarah stopped that night. No citations issued. No dashcam logs. No confirmation of who she spoke to at mile marker 23. It was like someone had wanted it to fade. But something else was off. Her logbook, her citation book, and her belt, all standard gear for a patrol shift, hadn't been found in the car. They'd been stored in her locker, which meant she'd come back to the station at some point that night. That detail had never made it into the official timeline. Not once. And as I stood there in that evidence room, holding her logbook in my hands, I saw something she'd written in the margin of her last entry. 3 letters. HC. Followed by meeting after shift. Something doesn't feel right. HC. Not Hayes. Crawford. And just like that, I had a name. And a reason to keep going. Detective Torres and I sat across from each other in a conference room that hadn't changed much since 1979. Same wood-paneled walls, same humming light fixture overhead, same stale air. She'd requested the original file on Sarah's disappearance, and it was thick, but not in the right way. Too many summaries. Too many no further action required stamps. We went page by page. The further we got, the more obvious it became that the initial investigation hadn't just missed things, it had ignored them. I asked Torres if anyone had ever followed up on Sarah's last reported stop. She shook her head. No ticket was written. No vehicle description. No follow-up. She tapped the page with her pen, and no effort to figure out who she was talking to. I leaned back and let that sink in. A patrol officer radios in a routine stop and then disappears. No witness, no citation, no paperwork, and the department never questioned it. The radio logs showed her last check-in at 9:47 p.m. The next scheduled check was for 10:30. By 10:05, Sarah had vanished. The only other detail came from the logbook I found in her locker. That one line, HC requesting meeting after shift, stood out like a whisper that never got to finish. Harold Crawford had been a sergeant back then. He worked closely with Captain Hayes. According to Torres, Crawford died in a single vehicle accident in '84. Rainy night. No skid marks. No investigation beyond the basic traffic fatality report. It wouldn't have meant much if Sarah hadn't written his initials on the last day of her life. Torres was already pulling duty rosters from October '79. And that's when the next thing surfaced. Sarah hadn't been scheduled to work that evening. Her name had originally been slotted for the day shift, but it had been changed at the last minute around 3:30 that afternoon to cover Highway 9 on night patrol. That change had been logged manually, in Hayes's handwriting. Torres stared at it longer than I did. That shift change wasn't random, she said. Somebody wanted her in that car in that place at that time. I asked if Hayes had ever been questioned about it. She said no. He wrote the schedule. He oversaw the shift. He signed off on the search when she disappeared. No one questioned him then, and nobody had asked since. I told her I wanted to interview him. She said it was too soon, not without more. But I had more. I had 15 years of notes, timelines, and transcripts, most of them built from memory, some gathered quietly from people who still lived in Millbrook. She agreed to let me assist unofficially. No badge, no authority, but she'd share what she found if I did the same. We started with Sarah's belongings. What was still held in evidence had been stored in a climate-controlled back room behind the main evidence cage. A few officers helped us pull the containers, her belt, her citation pad, her personal logbook, a half-used roll of film from her locker. The photographs were standard roadside scenes, car tags, a couple of damaged license plates, but nothing dated close to October. I held her logbook again and looked at the entry one more time. Meeting after shift, it read, "Something doesn't feel right." It wasn't fear. It was clarity. We went next to speak with Officer Patricia Mullins, retired now, but back in 1979, she'd worked closely with Sarah. I remembered her as the quiet one on Sarah's shift, someone who always stood 2 steps behind Hayes during department briefings. She lived on the outskirts of town, now kept a tidy home with lace curtains and fresh bread on the counter. When we asked about Sarah, she nodded slowly and said she still thought about her all the time. She wasn't scared, she said, but she knew something was off. I asked what Sarah had been worried about. Mullins poured a second cup of coffee and took a moment before answering. She thought there were people in the department doing things they shouldn't, looking the other way when they shouldn't. Torres asked if Sarah ever said who. Mullins shook her head. She didn't want to name names unless she had proof, but she said some of the older guys were living awfully nice for public servants. She didn't say Hayes. She didn't have to. The silence said it for her. Outside, Torres leaned on the hood of her car and looked across the street like she was putting the whole town under review. If Sarah had proof, she said it might still be out there. Somewhere. I told her there were too many people who wanted to believe Sarah just cracked under pressure. It was easier than facing what might have been happening under their noses. And even if she hadn't cracked, they told themselves it wasn't their job to push the issue. "There's always someone ready to close the door on a case like this," I said. Torres nodded. "But sometimes that door's got cracks in it." That night I got a call from a name I hadn't heard since I was 27. Frank Novak. He'd worked the motor pool for the department in 1979. His voice sounded older, raspier, like he'd been smoking since the Carter administration. He said, "I heard they found your sister's car. I think it's time we talked. We met the next morning at a diner 2 towns over." He wore a thick flannel shirt and kept glancing toward the door. When I asked what he remembered from the night Sarah disappeared, he said she'd come by the garage around 8:30, wanted to check on the patrol car's radio, said she had questions about whether anyone could monitor conversations from outside. I asked what he told her. Officially, no. But unofficially, yeah, there were ways. Then he said something that stuck with me. She was looking over her shoulder the whole time, like she knew someone was already listening. Torres asked why he never shared any of that during the original investigation. Novak looked down at his coffee for a long time. "Nobody asked me," he said. "And even if they had, I wouldn't have said much. People who talked too much about certain things around here didn't always have the best luck. We didn't push him further. We didn't have to." The unease in his voice said more than any sworn statement. As we drove back toward town, the clouds were low and the wind had picked up. The leaves were just starting to turn. Torres kept one hand on the wheel and the other on the file in her lap. She didn't say anything for a while. Then she said, "We're going to talk to Hayes, but not until we have more. We only get one shot at this." I agreed. We were close. Closer than anyone had been in 15 years. But close wasn't the same as safe. And it wasn't the same as ready. That afternoon I got another call, this time from David, Sarah's old fiancé. He said he'd been going through an old box of photos and letters. There was a note tucked inside one of her envelopes, short, folded into quarters. Just 5 words written in her handwriting. "If anything happens, ask Mike." He asked me what I thought it meant. I didn't know yet, but I intended to find out. I held that note in my hand longer than I should have. 5 words written in Sarah's hand. "If anything happens, ask Mike." The paper was worn at the fold, smoothed over at the edges, but the ink hadn't faded. It wasn't a warning. It wasn't even a message meant for me. It was something she left behind for someone else, knowing I'd understand the weight of it. David had found it inside an old envelope of hers tucked behind a Polaroid from the academy. He mailed it to me without a letter, just a sticky note that said, "Thought you'd want this?" I did. but wanting it and being ready for it were two different things. I kept the note in a folder with the logbook photocopy and the roster from October 15th. One quiet piece among dozens. But it shifted everything. The next morning, Torres called. She'd tracked down a second former officer willing to talk. Name was Paul Novak, no relation to Frank from the motor pool. Paul had been a dispatcher back in '79, new to the department, young enough that most people forgot he was even working that night. He lived 2 counties over now, retired early, said he had back issues from an old wreck. We met him at a diner just off Route 12. He wore a heavy fleece jacket, kept one hand wrapped around a coffee cup, like he didn't trust it not to vanish. When Torres asked what he remembered about the night Sarah disappeared, he didn't hesitate. She came back to the station. Around 9:15, maybe 9:20. She looked focused, not scared, like someone trying to solve something before the clock ran out. I asked if she said anything to him. He nodded. She asked to use the secure line in the comms room, said she needed to make a call outside the department. He glanced around the diner, then back at us. She didn't want anyone hearing it over the radio. Torres asked who she called. He said he didn't know for sure, but he heard bits of the conversation. She was talking about evidence, notes, possibly photographs. Said she had enough to make someone nervous, and she said names. Crawford, Hayes, one he didn't catch. That part of it I already knew. But hearing it from someone else, someone who had been in the building that night, tied it to the timeline in a way no document ever could. I asked why he never came forward. He stared at the tabletop for a while. Because Hayes ran that station like he owned it. And because the next morning Crawford pulled me aside and said it was best to keep my memory short. He gave a short laugh. I wasn't brave. I was just trying to stay employed. We drove back in silence for a long time. Torres finally said, "That's the second person who's told us Sarah returned to the station that night, which means the original timeline is wrong." I told her it wasn't just wrong, it was convenient. Erasing that return visit meant erasing the phone call, the file locker, the person who might have overheard something. Erasing the proof she was being watched. They didn't fail her, I said. They buried her. The next day we went to see Captain Hayes. He still lived in the same house on Maple Street, single story, newer siding, fresh paint. The kind of home you don't pay off on a public servant's salary, not without help. He answered the door himself. Still broad-shouldered, though the years had added weight in the face and softened the edges of his stance. "Detective Torres," he said, stepping back from the doorway. "Mr. Landry, I heard they found the car. Terrible thing." His voice was measured, practiced, like someone used to leading press briefings. Inside the living room was full of department memorabilia. Framed certificates, a shadow box with commendation medals, photographs from department picnics and award ceremonies. Sarah was in 2 of them. Her smile caught in that same tilt of the chin she always had when trying to look serious. Torres opened the conversation gently, asking if he remembered anything new about Sarah's disappearance now that the car had been recovered. He kept his eyes on her, but glanced at me when he answered. "Nothing new. It's been 15 years. You know how memory works." She asked about the schedule change, the one that placed Sarah on Highway 9 the night she disappeared. "Routine staffing issue," he said. "Somebody called out. She was available. That's how it worked." His words were clean. His tone wasn't. I asked if he recalled Sarah coming back to the station during her shift. He said he didn't. Said once they deployed, he usually didn't see patrol officers again until end of watch. Torres followed up with a more direct line. Did he remember Sarah ever expressing concerns about misconduct in the department? Hayes's posture shifted. Not defensively, just tightly. "That's a serious accusation," he said, "and I ran a clean house. If she had concerns, she didn't bring them to me. I looked him in the eye and said, maybe she tried to. He didn't respond, just stared back, the kind of stare that used to end interviews before they began. But this time it didn't work. We left after 20 minutes. He didn't ask us to come back. Torres didn't say much until we were halfway down the street. Then she said, he's hiding something. I agreed. But we weren't ready to confront him yet, not without a third voice to triangulate the truth. We needed someone who could speak to Sarah's state of mind, her intentions, maybe even her plans. That night, I went back to my study and pulled out every file I had on Sarah's cases from the 6 months before she vanished. There was one that stood out, a drug possession case dismissed after a pretrial motion filed by Crawford himself. That alone wasn't unusual. What was strange was the original arresting officer. It wasn't Sarah. It was another name I didn't recognize. Officer Benjamin Morris, a beat cop who'd left the department in 1980. I circled the case number and added it to my growing board of inconsistencies. The next morning, Torres called again. Said she'd spoken to someone who used to work the records room. A civilian clerk named Maria Santos. She'd retired the year before, but had something she wanted us to see. We met her in the back office of her church. She volunteered there a few days a week. She brought out an old manila envelope yellowed at the edges, marked only with Sarah's name in small block letters. I found it behind a filing cabinet when I was cleaning out my desk, she said. I didn't know what to do with it, but I kept it. Inside were handwritten notes, plate numbers, dates, and a list of vehicle stops that never made it into any official database. There were also copies of reports, not final drafts, just carbon duplicates like she was compiling a record for herself in case the real ones disappeared. At the very bottom of the envelope was a single page torn at the top, typed in Sarah's voice. To whom it may concern, it began. I am reporting misconduct within the Millbrook Police Department. I have documented traffic stops involving officers accepting bribes to overlook illegal activity along Highway 9. The individuals involved include... The letter cut off mid-sentence. Torres looked at me. I looked back at her. We didn't say it, but we knew what we were holding. It wasn't proof, not yet. But it was the edge of something solid, and we were finally starting to pull it free. The next morning I sat with the envelope again. Spread out across the desk, Sarah's notes looked less like scribbles and more like a case file. License plates, shift times, dates, badge numbers, brief notes in the margins refused to log, large cache in console interrupted by H. There were even rough sketches of vehicles likely drawn from memory. At the bottom of one sheet, she'd written a single phrase in block letters. These aren't mistakes. It didn't read like someone in over their head. It read like someone trying to hold a cracked door shut while the pressure built behind it. Torres had taken the originals into evidence the night before, but I made copies first, just enough to keep my own trail intact if something went wrong. She called later that day. Her voice was tight-clipped. Forensics had just finished their initial report on the patrol car. The lab confirmed traces of blood on the seat fabric. Human type O negative. That matched Sarah's blood type. After 15 years, the sample was degraded, but the pattern suggested blunt trauma possibly followed by a gunshot. They also found something else, gunshot residue in the cabin. Enough to confirm a weapon had been discharged from inside the car. The dented driver's door, the lodged sediment in the undercarriage, the forced entry marks around the glove box. They all told the same story. Sarah hadn't driven into the river. She'd been forced off the road, or worse, already dead before the car ever hit the water. Torres and I went through the file again, page by page this time, cross-checking Sarah's incident logs against department records. She'd stopped some of the same vehicles more than once, same make, same plates weeks apart, always with different officers responding for backup. Every time the stop was aborted. No citation, no search, no documentation beyond the radio logs. And most of the repeat stops took place along Highway 9 between mile marker 21 and 26. the same stretch where she disappeared. It wasn't proof of anything yet, but it looked like a pattern. The kind of pattern you don't notice unless you're the one keeping count. Sarah had noticed, and she'd written it all down. Later that week, we tracked down someone else who had worked in the department back then, a retired officer named Marcus Wright. He'd left the force in '85, moved to Ohio, worked private security for a while. We called ahead, said we were looking into a cold case. He agreed to meet at a diner just outside Akron. When we sat down, he didn't ask why we were there. He just said it was bound to come back around. Torres asked what he meant. He didn't look at either of us, just stirred his coffee, then said, "She knew. Sarah. She wasn't like the rest of us. She actually believed in what the badge was supposed to mean. He said she came to him once in the fall of '79. Quiet, nervous, asking questions about departmental finances. Said she'd seen a pattern in the arrests and wanted to know how to file something confidential. I told her to be careful," Wright said. Told her there were people who didn't want the pattern noticed. When I asked who, he finally looked at me. Hayes, Crawford, maybe a couple others. I didn't ask. Didn't want to know. He said they were running protection for someone. Maybe local, maybe out of state. Letting certain cars move through undisturbed. You didn't stop them, you didn't search them, and you didn't ask who was behind the wheel. I asked what they got in return. Cash, he said. Enough to keep people comfortable. Vacations, cars, home upgrades, all under the radar. He wasn't proud of it. He wasn't making excuses either, just laying it out. Said the system had been bigger than any one person. That when Sarah started asking questions, she became the crack in the wall, and they couldn't afford the wall coming down. We left that diner with more questions than we'd brought in, but also with something else confirmation, not just from the paper trail, but from someone who had seen it firsthand. Torres contacted the district attorney's office the next day, sent over summaries audio from the Wright interview redacted files and Sarah's unfinished letter. She didn't push for charges yet, just asked them to review it quietly. The DA James Fletcher agreed to assign someone from his team. Told us off the record that if half of what we were saying could be corroborated, it could open one of the largest corruption cases in the county's history. Back at my office, I stayed late. Most nights I'd take a walk before heading home just down the block around the square. Clear my head. That night I felt it before I saw it. A low thrum in my chest. Not fear, exactly, just alertness. I slowed my pace, glanced across the street. A dark sedan parked at the edge of the lot, lights off, engine still ticking. I walked a little further, then doubled back toward the alley, circled around, watched from the shadows. No one got out. But it didn't feel random. The next morning, both my car tires had been slashed. No note, no message, just 2 clean cuts in silence. Torres didn't flinch when I told her. She just nodded and said, "Then we're close." She requested internal support from the state bureau officers she trusted, and she started checking access logs for anyone who'd viewed the reopened case file in the last 2 weeks. 3 names came up, 2 routine, 1 unexpected. Sergeant Glenn Wilkes, still active, longtime officer. Had served under Hayes in the late '70s. On paper, his record was clean, but when Torres pulled his logs, something stood out. Wilkes had accessed the storage log for Sarah's evidence folder the same day we'd submitted it. No official reason listed, just a quiet access point at 6:47 p.m. Torres didn't confront him. Not yet. Instead, we decided to run a test. She fed 3 different pieces of false information to 3 separate people inside the department. Said she'd found new evidence, a potential witness, a sealed safety deposit box. Within 24 hours, a call went to Hayes' lawyer asking about admissibility of bank evidence, something we'd only mentioned to Wilkes. That was the leak. And suddenly, this wasn't just about what happened in 1979. It was about what someone was still willing to protect now. We didn't know how far it went. We didn't know who else was listening. But something Sarah had written tucked into the corner of a report copy kept circling back in my head. Just one sentence, faint pencil across the margin. If they find out, I know I'm not safe. It wasn't just a theory. She'd seen something. She tried to report it. And 15 years later, even her paper trail was still dangerous to follow. That evening, Torres called again. Quiet voice, like she was choosing every word. Forensics had processed the rest of the vehicle. Beneath the rusted floor panel embedded in the fabric beneath the seat, they found a fragment of magnetic tape. Not much, just a sliver, but it looked like part of a microcassette, the kind used in handheld recorders back then. Sarah's kind. Torres said if that tape held what I think it did, someone knew, and someone went looking for it. We weren't just chasing a cold case anymore. We were walking into something that still had teeth. And now it knew we were coming. I brought the tape fragment to a contact I trusted, an old friend from law school who'd transitioned into forensic audio work for the state. His name was Mark Fenley. Quiet, precise. One of those people who could sit in front of a waveform for hours without blinking. We met after hours at his lab. He didn't promise much. Said anything left after 15 years in water would likely be unusable. But he took the sliver of tape and looked at it under magnification. Magnetic layers still partially intact, he said. If we're lucky, maybe a few seconds of audio survived. But it'll take time. I left it with him, not expecting a miracle, just wanting to know if there was anything left of Sarah's voice at all. That night, I couldn't sleep. The quiet had changed. It wasn't the stillness of a cold case anymore. It was a kind of weight, like the walls were holding their breath. The next morning, I found an envelope taped to the front door of my office. No postage, no markings, just my name in block letters. Inside was a grainy photograph, black and white, surveillance style. It showed Torres stepping into the county records office, alone. A red marker had drawn an X on her back. I called her immediately. She was calm as always. Said she'd gotten a similar message tucked under her windshield wiper that morning. It read, "You're not the first to dig here. Others stayed buried." She forwarded both to the state's internal affairs team, but we knew what it meant. This wasn't a threat from the past. This was now. And whoever we were getting close to, Hayes Wilkes, maybe more, they weren't just watching. They were preparing. We decided to shift tactics. If we couldn't move forward quietly, we'd move loud enough to rattle them. Torres reached out to the district attorney's office again this time, requesting direct assistance from a federal agency. Not just for backup, but for oversight. Within 48 hours, Special Agent Claire Morrison from the FBI's Corruption Task Force arrived in Millbrook. Middle-aged, sharp-eyed, and plain-spoken Morrison had spent her career investigating small-town law enforcement networks that had rotted from the inside. When she sat down across from us, she didn't ask for a summary. She asked for the files. Everything. Raw. Unfiltered. We gave her Sarah's reports, the interview with Marcus Wright, the photos, the internal logs we'd copied before the server lockouts began. Morrison didn't take notes. She just read slowly, and when she finally looked up, she said, "This isn't a cold case anymore. It's an active cover-up." With Morrison on board, we began reconstructing the last 48 hours of Sarah's life in detail. Using her shift notes, vehicle logs, the call sheet from dispatch, and Novak's statement, we pinned her movements almost minute by minute. At 7:42 p.m., she signed out her unit. At 8:16, she pulled into the department motor pool to ask about the radio frequency. At 9:15, she returned to the station briefly, possibly to use the secure line according to 2 separate testimonies. Her last radio contact came at 9:47. She never checked in again. The supposed timeline offered by Hayes 15 years earlier placed her on the road by 10:00 p.m., suggesting she simply vanished in the middle of patrol. But Sarah had been back at the station barely 90 minutes before that final call, which meant someone there might have seen her, or followed her. Morrison asked to review the original incident files logged by dispatch that night. Not the digital records, the paper backups. That's when something else cracked open. A clerk named Linda Choi, a junior records tech at the time, had kept a backup box of misfiled logs from the 1970s in storage. She brought us a battered plastic crate filled with yellowing report sheets and carbon copies. Tucked between two folded manila folders was a half-torn page with Sarah's badge number at the top. It wasn't a citation. It was a transcription. A dispatch record handwritten. The words were faint but legible Patterson to base. Traffic stop. White sedan. Occupied once. No backup required. The timestamp read 9:48. 1 minute after her last confirmed radio contact. And the location mile marker 23. That sheet had never made it into the official case file. And the voice logs from that night, according to department record, had been erased due to a malfunction. But here it was. A single page. A missing minute of her life. A witness statement from Sarah herself locked in the margins of a forgotten form. I stared at it for a long time. Morrison traced her finger down the page. White sedan, she said. That's the third mention. She pulled up one of Sarah's original reports, October 6th. Same plate number, same model. Traffic stop ended early when backup was called off by a senior officer. Who was in that car, I asked. Morrison didn't answer. She just started dialing. Over the next week, we compiled every stop Sarah had conducted in her final month, any vehicle she'd flagged more than once, any name that showed up in both her notes and the department's electronic roster. A name kept surfacing. Franklin Martinez. Arrested twice in the summer of '79. Drug charges later dropped. Detained by Sarah once without charge. Last known address listed as a repair shop outside of town. The building was boarded up now, abandoned. But through a federal witness database, Morrison tracked him to Arizona. New identity. New address. New life. But he agreed to speak reluctantly. We set up a secure call. Morrison asked the questions. I just listened. Martinez didn't waste time. She was straight, he said. That cop, Patterson, wouldn't take money, wouldn't take favors. Didn't care who you knew. He told us something else. 5 days before Sarah disappeared, she showed up where he was delivering a package on Highway 9. Not for an arrest, not for a search, just to watch. She was taking pictures, he said, of the transfer, the money, the people. I asked if any of those people were cops. He didn't pause. One of them was in uniform. He didn't know the name, but he remembered the patch. Millbrook Police Department. Morrison closed her notebook. We've got motive, she said. We've got pattern. Now we just need the push. That push came sooner than we thought. The next morning I showed up to my office early, just after 6. The building alarm had been tripped at 4:11 a.m. The front window was shattered. Glass across the rug. And sitting on my desk was a tape recorder. Old, scratched, and inside it no tape. Just a note. You're getting close. Stop. I didn't call Torres. I drove straight to her office. She took one look at it and called in a forensics team. Fingerprints, casing, handwriting all logged. But we both knew what it meant. The missing tape, the one Sarah might have recorded, was still out there, and someone wanted us to know it had changed hands. Back at the FBI field office, Morrison opened a case board and began assigning connections. Hayes, Crawford, Wilkes, Wright, the vehicles, the bribes, the erasures, Sarah's letter, her final call, the missing audio. We stood there in silence, watching it all unfold across the board. Piece by piece, line by line, like a map we'd spent too long trying to draw blind. Then Torres stepped back. Her eyes locked on one thing. Crawford's death, she said. Single car accident, straight road, clear weather, no braking. Morrison raised an eyebrow. Run the report, she said. Every word, every file. Let's see what really killed Harold Crawford. By then, I wasn't sure which terrified me more, that we were finally seeing the truth, or that someone else already knew we had. Torres had already requested the original accident report on Harold Crawford, but when the file arrived, Morrison and I could see it had been thinly compiled, just 6 pages, mostly boilerplate. No toxicology report, no mechanical inspection beyond a summary. The photographs were grainy black and white, poorly framed, and none of them showed the driver's side floor well. The report listed weather conditions as clear road surface as dry and cause of death as blunt force trauma consistent with high-speed impact. The investigator on record, Sergeant Glenn Wilkes. Same Wilkes who had accessed Sarah's file without authorization just a week earlier. That detail didn't need to be said aloud. We all saw it at the same time. Morrison quietly closed the folder and said, "I want the car." We had no idea if the vehicle even still existed. It had been over a decade and a half. But Torres made the calls, pulled the paperwork, and located the salvage company that had received the wreck in 1984. The car was still there, stored off-site, never crushed, marked as evidentiary hold for a case that had long been closed. When we got to the yard, the lot manager led us to the far edge of the property where rusted-out shells were stacked in rows like forgotten bones. Crawford's Buick was sitting alone, partially covered by a weather tarp that flapped in the breeze. The front end was caved in from the crash, windshield gone, hood folded upward. But the driver's side floorboard, what we were there to examine, was still intact. Morrison crouched down and ran a gloved hand along the brake line assembly. After a minute, she stood up and called over Torres. "This was cut," she said, "and not by the crash." I leaned in and saw it myself, clean slice through the line just above the connector. Not the kind of damage that happens in a high-speed impact. Morrison had seen this before. "This wasn't an accident," she said quietly. "Somebody wanted him to die behind the wheel. That changed everything." If Crawford had been killed, then it wasn't just about protecting secrets. It was about silencing people who knew too much. That made at least 2 suspicious deaths tied to the same cluster of officers. Sarah and now Harold. We were no longer chasing corruption. We were chasing a body count. And the deeper we went, the more the lines blurred between who was covering up a mistake and who had become part of a criminal conspiracy. Morrison briefed the district attorney's office and requested a dedicated team to re-examine every death connected to the 1979 shift calendar. Officers, witnesses, even informants. Some had relocated, some had died, some had disappeared completely. The net was wider than we'd thought, and it was starting to tighten. Around that time, we heard from Maria Santos again. She'd worked as a records clerk at the Millbrook station in 1979, and she'd been the one to turn over Sarah's hidden files. This time, she came in person. She brought a sealed envelope she said she had kept tucked inside an old Bible for over 15 years. I wasn't sure if it was important, she told us, but I remembered the handwriting, and it didn't sit right. Inside were 2 things, a single cassette tape labeled 10-15-79 and a folded sheet of notebook paper in Sarah's writing. The letter was unfinished. "If anything happens to me," it began, "please give this to someone outside the department. I've tried to report what I've seen. They won't listen. I'm scared. But I'm not backing down." Morrison took the cassette straight to her office. The tape quality was poor, degraded, but recoverable. We listened together through static and hiss. At first, just ambient noise, then a car door, footsteps on gravel, and then Sarah's voice, low nervous. "This is Officer Patterson," she said. "October 15th, 1979. I'm meeting Sergeant Crawford tonight. He doesn't know I'm recording this. I need a record in case something happens." More silence. Then faintly the sound of another car pulling up. Male voice older. "You shouldn't be here, Sarah." Her voice trembled. "You asked to meet." The man sounded tense. "I told you to let this go." "I can't," she said. You're protecting something. Someone. And I have the files." The tape crackled. Voices overlapped. "They'll ruin you," he said. "They'll ruin me too. But I won't let you destroy everything." Then a scuffle, the sound of movement, a sharp thud, and then nothing. The tape went quiet. Torres pressed pause. "Is that the end?" Morrison rewound and checked. It was. Sarah never finished the recording. We sat in silence for a moment before Morrison stood and said, "We just got probable cause." The next step was arrest. We didn't have the whole list yet, but we had enough. Hayes Wilkes and a man named Marcus Dunleavy, an officer who had retired in 1985 and had been named in one of Sarah's original reports. The warrant package went to the DA by the end of the day. But something didn't sit right with me. I kept thinking about the voice on that tape. It didn't sound like Hayes. It was lower, rougher. Morrison confirmed it matched Crawford, which meant Hayes hadn't been present at the murder. He might have ordered it, covered it up, but he hadn't pulled the trigger. And if Crawford was now dead killed in what we believed was another silencing, then someone else was helping Hayes manage the cleanup. That night I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. The voice was disguised, run through some kind of filter. Just one sentence. "If you speak his name, we'll come for yours." I recorded the message, logged the time, gave it to Morrison the next morning. She was already on edge. We'd learned that one of the files we'd submitted Sarah's final letter draft had gone missing from the DA's office overnight. Not the copy, but the original. The one with her handwriting, her fingerprint smudges. No sign of forced entry. No camera footage from that hallway. The theft was surgical. Someone on the inside. Torres brought in internal affairs. Morrison increased federal surveillance. But I could feel the clock ticking. We weren't chasing ghosts anymore. We were being hunted back. We scheduled a decoy meeting. Torres leaked a false witness location to Wilkes through a planted document. Then we waited. He took the bait. Surveillance caught him making a call to Hayes's landline that night, 9:17 p.m. No message left, just a single ring and hang-up. The signal we'd been hoping for. We'd found the channel. Now it was time to trace the current. That's when Morrison said, "We're going to flush them out. Set a time, set a place, and give them something they can't ignore." She looked straight at me. "Michael, it's going to have to be you." I knew what she meant. Sarah's voice was gone. Her evidence mostly stolen or degraded. But I was the thread still connecting everything. I had the files, the memory, the motive. And maybe, just maybe, I had what they still feared. I didn't say yes right away. I sat with it for a night, thought about the risk, the history, the sister who'd driven alone that night believing the truth would protect her. Then I thought about the tape, the scuffle, the silence. I called Torres the next morning. "I'll do it," I said. "Just tell me when." She didn't hesitate. "Tomorrow night," she said. 8 p.m., Morrison Warehouse. We leak it at noon, and we'll see who shows up to make it disappear. I hung up and looked at my reflection in the office window. My face 15 years older than the last time I saw Sarah. I said her name under my breath. Then I said it again, out loud, like I was daring someone to come stop me. I arrived at the Morrison Warehouse 20 minutes before the meeting time. The sun had already dropped below the skyline, and the last of the light was bleeding out along the rooftops like a slow spill. The building sat on the edge of the industrial district, surrounded by cracked pavement and half-abandoned loading bays. From the outside, it looked like every other forgotten structure in that part of town. But inside, Torres and the FBI were already in place. Audio lines run surveillance positioned exits marked. The plan was simple. I would play the part of the supposed witness, the one who'd allegedly seen Sarah alive after her final radio transmission. The information had already been seeded through Sergeant Williams just like we'd planned. Now we were waiting to see if Hayes or whoever still stood with him would take the bait. Morrison checked my wire one last time, her hands steady, voice low. You only speak if they do. No unnecessary escalation. If they try anything, backup's already here. I nodded. My palms were damp, even though the air inside the warehouse was cool. Torres stood at the far end of the room, out of sight, but not far. She had a clear line of vision, and I could feel her watching. At exactly 7:56 p.m., I heard the sound of tires on gravel. A vehicle idled, then cut its engine. Then another. We counted 3. My heart was steady, but there was a strange detachment behind my eyes, like my body was walking into something the rest of me hadn't caught up to yet. The first man through the door wasn't Hayes. It was Dunleavy. He looked older than I remembered from his file photo, gray around the temples, but still solid. The kind of build that doesn't soften with age. He scanned the space, saw me standing by the support column, then nodded behind him. Hayes entered next, his expression tight and unreadable. A third man followed, someone I didn't recognize, shorter, stockier, dressed like he'd stepped out of a corporate boardroom. None of them spoke right away. Hayes stepped forward and said, "So, you're the witness." I didn't respond. Let the silence hold. Let him fill it. He glanced toward the others, then turned back to me. You know your sister. She didn't understand what she was walking into. She thought exposing us would fix something, that it would make the world better. I kept my voice calm. You killed her. Hayes's mouth twitched. We did what we had to do. It wasn't supposed to end that way. He stepped closer. But you're not her. And if you're here just to posture, we can end this cleanly. He looked toward the man in the suit. That man reached inside his coat, just briefly. I didn't move. Through the mic, Morrison's voice was a whisper in my ear. We've got enough. Don't push it. But I needed him to say it. I needed it on record. You staged the whole thing I said. You faked a transfer, intercepted her patrol route, cut her off before she could file the report. You buried her. Then you buried Crawford. That last name did something. The man in the suit shifted. Hayes's jaw clenched. He was going to talk, he said. He made his choice when he started drinking and mouthing off to the wrong people. His voice dropped. And so did Sarah. I heard it then, what we'd come for. Not just implication, not just denial, but ownership. The silence that followed was thick. For a moment it felt like no one would breathe again. Then Torres's voice cut across the floor. Federal agents, drop your weapons. Everything moved at once. The man in the suit pulled a pistol too late. 3 red dots marked his chest before he could aim. Dunleavy went to ground, hands raised. Hayes froze, caught between flight and defeat. And I just stood there, watching the entire thing fold in on itself. They cuffed Hayes where he stood right under the metal rafters. He didn't resist, didn't even speak. The man in the suit was disarmed and removed. Dunleavy refused to make eye contact. It was over in less than 2 minutes. Morrison walked over to me as the warehouse cleared. You did exactly what we needed, she said. We have the recording. We have their admissions, and we have them. I should have felt relief, closure. But all I could think about was Sarah out there somewhere, still buried in woods no one had stepped into for 15 years. He said they moved her, I told Torres. 10 miles north, state forest, near the logging road. She nodded. We'll find her, Michael. We'll bring her home. That night I didn't go back to my office. I drove instead. Out past the edges of town into the dark stretches of forest that still held more silence than I could explain. I didn't stop until the road narrowed into gravel. No lights, no signs, just trees and the wind pushing gently through their tops. I left the car running and stood by the hood, and for a long time I listened. For what, I couldn't say. Maybe just for the echo of her voice. The one we'd recovered grainy and scared and brave. The one that finally, after all this time, had started to be heard. The excavation began before sunrise. The November air was sharp, and everything in the clearing felt muted, like the forest itself was holding its breath. I stood back with Torres and Agent Morrison while the forensics team worked in quiet rhythm, brush by brush, layer by layer. There was no ceremony, just focus. The kind that comes with knowing you're recovering more than just remains. You're recovering the truth. It took them 3 days to bring her home. Sarah's badge was found beside her, still clipped to what was left of her belt. Her engagement ring, too. Time had taken almost everything else, but not that. Not what mattered. They confirmed it was her through dental records. Dr. Walsh handled it personally, and when she pulled me aside at the end, she said something I'll never forget. Your sister was brave in ways most people can't imagine. It wasn't about how she died. It was how she lived, what she tried to protect, and who she stood against. The arrest of Robert Hayes and the others was only the start. Sergeant Williams was indicted shortly after. So were 3 more civilians tied to the trafficking ring. One of them, a warehouse owner, turned over financial ledgers that dated back to 1977. It was all there. The payments, the false reports, the staged busts, the cases that were thrown for cash. Detective Marcus Wright, once part of the same force that buried Sarah's case, testified for the prosecution. He said it straight. We told ourselves it was about control. It wasn't. It was about greed. And when Sarah wouldn't bend, we let her die for it. His testimony helped seal the racketeering charges. The final trial lasted 6 weeks. Hayes was found guilty on all counts: murder, conspiracy, obstruction, and federal corruption. He died 2 years later in prison. No memorial, no visitors. His name doesn't come up much anymore, and when it does, it's just a caution. We laid Sarah to rest under a wide oak in Millbrook Cemetery. The department gave her a full service, this time honor guard, folded flag, the works. Not because it fixed anything, not because it made up for 15 years of silence, but because she earned it. David Chun came in from California. He spoke at the service. I watched him place her ring back on her headstone and say goodbye, like it was still spring of '79. We all lost something different when we lost Sarah. Some of us lost a sister, a partner, a friend. But the town? The town lost its conscience, and now, finally, it had a chance to get it back. The foundation I started in Sarah's name has grown into something I never expected. We help families with cold cases now, ones that were ignored, mishandled, or just forgotten. And every time we take one on, I think of her, of that night, of that tape that never got to play. And I remember why I kept going. Not out of anger, not even out of grief, but because someone had to keep her voice from fading. And because justice, real justice, isn't loud. It's quiet. It takes years. It takes everything you've got. I still drive out to the memorial sometimes. Mile marker 23 on Highway 9. There's a plaque there now with her name. People leave flowers, notes. A few have left badges. I never take anything away. I just sit for a while. Let the wind move through the trees. Let the silence say what words can't. If this story stayed with you, or if someone in your life ever disappeared without answers, share it. Speak their name. That's how we bring people home, even after all this time.